So, someone who shall remain anonymous, but is in this room, recently said, and then we get to the indicators, and that's the end of the process. That's not really true, because metrics and measurements and monitoring runs throughout this TMA process. And over the next half an hour, Jenny and I are going to talk through how we are doing metrics and measurements in some TMA projects at the moment, and how we would advise groups to work in this area moving forward. So, when and how are metrics used during the TMA process? So we're going to look at when, the timing. When during those 4 steps should members of the evidence team be involved, and what are the key evidence steps during the TMA process? And then also how. How can we learn internally, and how can we influence externally? When I say learn internally, I'm very interested in learning at the program level, at the project, the TMA intervention level, and then also, of course, peer-to-peer, platform-to-platform learning within the TMA process. So how can projects and programs learn and adapt? And what sort of considerations do we need to give in terms of documentation around those 2 elements? So, out of the 4 steps, how many steps do you think involve some sort of measurement or metrics component? Genevieve, Kelly?
4 out of 4.
4 out of 4. Yeah, there's a role for evidence teams and metrics at all 4 steps of the TMA process. So we start with step 1, setting the strategic framework. And here we're really looking to answer the question, who is the market failing? We've seen through Megan's presentation earlier in the week how we will calculate a universal need, a need component, and the current use component. And also, as part of that, calculate the total potential market size for the product or commodity that we're working with. And this is a really nice place for synergies between different departments within the organization, between program analytics and the routine monitoring and research functions, because in some instances this information will come out of a modeling process, which is fed by survey data collected by research teams or estimates from monitoring activities that Megan takes with models that the PA team generate or use from other providers to come up with those use and need estimates in terms of total number of products, latrines, malaria rapid diagnostic tests, or ACT courses, for example. And this is, as we've seen, this is our purpose level indicator for the population at need. So following that, we have step 2, understanding the total market. And this is the second critical step that involves the measurement of metrics components. We're examining the health of the market. We're looking at past market trends and maybe trying to forecast future performance, and assessing the market failures across the core and the supporting functions. And this step here actually, not counterintuitively, but this is actually the bulk of the presentation today. We're going to go back and look at what these metrics are that can be gathered at this step and which we will track continually throughout the life of the project, and also hopefully will raise the question of who can continue to track these things into the future if we are concerned about showing sustainability and scale beyond the funding life of the project. Fred, fantastic set of slides, excellent examples from Madagascar. It's really, really amazing. I'm sad to have not been there. It showed us the steps that the Madagascar team recently went through in order to design the intervention. And there are many moments during that process where an indicator or a question of metrics can easily come into the discussion. Fred finished his presentation with a set of activities down the right-hand side. A lot of those were kind of binary, yes, this has been achieved, or no, this has not been achieved, criteria. But others were related to funding amounts, or possibly dissemination events, or discussions in Parliament that are moving towards a change in policy. And so step 4, create some indicators, and that's the last part. It's not really true, but this is a good opportunity to pull it all together, to take those activities and to represent them perhaps visually in terms of chains of activities and events that will lead through to outputs and outcomes and your eventual goal, and certainly to put them in the form of a log frame, as this is something that donors are always going to require of the teams. So we see here we have metrics and measurements at all stages of the process, and they cut across all three or four levels of the TMA framework. Again, so if we just look at the framework, we have use over need at the population level here at the top, but we're also very concerned about identifying the failures and tracking those changes as we go through our intervention. So I hope that was dancing aside, simple, hopefully not controversial introduction to the topic. And I want to hand over to Jenny to talk about the sort of metrics that we have available for measuring the core functions through the TMA process.
So the name of the session is Complete Metrics, which is not complete metrics, it's more like complete metrics. And mostly, and I say that in kind of in jest, but I say that because I think both Steve and I are coming at this from a position of humility, from a position of this being a new area, being something that we're learning from still, something that we're documenting, and something that our knowledge is evolving in our ways of developing these indicators and thinking about them is also kind of constantly changing and hopefully improving and getting more precise. So that said, let's jump into core function indicators. And just to highlight again what we're talking about here, we're talking about this middle area within this framework that we've established. And Megan presented us with kind of the solid and anchored use over need at the top. And Fred talked a little bit about the activity level indicators at the bottom. So what we're talking about here is kind of this more fluid center area. And we're going to start with that first box, which is the core function indicators. And there are two core function indicators that we're going to present, which is market breadth and market depth. When we talk about market breadth, we're talking about the 4 Ps. About products, price, place, promotion. And under each of those, we have a set of proposed indicators. I think the critical take-home message with market breadth and depth, and I'll give you the answer right away, is that we need to measure these independently of whether or not we're using them to measure our project success. And this is because this comes at an understanding of what the market looks like. It becomes a part of the market landscape, and it's something that we have to keep an eye on regardless of whether or not we're operating in such a way that we are implementing something that will directly change these. So that said, I'm going to go through each one of these and then present the why of why we're addressing these. But just to say that, when we're talking about products, we're talking about the range of products available in the market, not only our own, but every product within the category available in the market. When we're talking about price, too, we're talking about price points and trade margins and subsidy of all the products in the market, not only our common brand, not only the products that are specific to us. When we talk about places, we're talking about all of the players in the market across the spectrum, from the manufacturers to the consumers, all players along the spectrum, and the availability of products and services. And when we talk about promotion, we talk about not only the engagement in demand creation, but also the level of demand creation by each player within the spectrum. But when we talk about market depth, which I'll go along to now, we're talking about the size of the market. So we're talking about total volume and total value. So total volume, it's the aggregate of all the products and services within the market, our own plus everybody else who's acting along that category. And by total value, it's the aggregate consumer price of products and services value in the market. As I mentioned, in some instances, we will be implementing interventions or a part or supporting interventions that will act on these indicators, and we will expect change. In other cases, and I want to bring this back to a comment from the previous conversation, there are unintended consequences of our actions within a market. And we need to be able to determine what is going on in the market, and that's why we need to track it, even though we can't, it's not an attribution indicator. It's an indicator that will allow us to know what's going on and what the changes are. We always are going back to this idea of this process being iterative, right? So we have this iterative process where, we're measuring things and, making decisions and prioritizing and designing interventions. And then we have to go back and measure them again and keep an eye on these, and that becomes part of the iterative process. So when we look at market breadth, we're looking at the range of products available in the market. And why is that important? But when we look at the range of products available in the market, it allows us to look at both the opportunities and threats that might be occurring within that market. So if we have an occasion in which the range of products is decreasing in a market over time, that might be a red flag that someone's being cannibalized, right? So that's something that we need to keep an eye on. Why would we measure price points? Why do we measure price points in a market? Because it allows us to determine whether there are products that are affordable to different consumers. It allows us to set prices for our own products and identify gaps within the market. Again, trade margins. It allows us to look at those incentives. We've been talking a lot about the incentives of the different players along the market, and looking at trade margins allows us to look at what the incentives are for participating in the market. Place, the number of players along the spectrum, also determine gaps for the program to fill, and whether there's an adequate supply base along the spectrum. And place also has a geographic component to it, which allows us to identify certain areas that might be underserved. In promotion, there are two indicators here that we're presenting, and one is the capacity to do demand generation, and the other is the opportunities or bottlenecks for demand at each level of the spectrum. And like I said, there are other reasons for measuring these indicators, but in most projects, I would say it's important for us to always keep these in mind and measure them as part of our landscaping and do continual monitoring of them. In total volume, which we're moving on to the depth of the market, we're measuring the size of the market, and that will allow us to look at trends in demand and availability and supply base. But it also is an important indicator to help us do our own forecasting and our own analysis of where we fit in within the market when we disaggregate it by what part of that volume corresponds to our projects. and total value, which is the money spent by consumers on products during the course of a calendar year. And this is an indicator of market sustainability. And here, sustainability takes on a bit of a different meaning than what we've discussed previously. Not the sustainability that Fred was discussing, but a market sustainability. And these are what we have for these core function indicators. And in some cases, these are going to be really informative and helpful to track the health of the market. But these indicators are also very health area specific. So in looking at these, we need to ensure that we have input from all the health area technical advisors. We need to have them on board to ensure that what we're measuring is relevant to the health area. And it's really interesting because I definitely don't claim to have any kind of expertise in sanitation, but this gets really complex in areas like sanitation, and having that health area input is really, really critical. We wanted to follow